Yesterday, we heard about specialized venture capital and how bringing in an investor that's focused on a specific type of company, a specific part of the industry, or a specific category can benefit you as a brand. But what about the opposite end of the investor spectrum? How can a massive corporation help you as a partner? And what does it mean to take capital from such an investor? Founded over a century ago, PepsiCo has a portfolio of some of the top brands in the snack set. And while you may know them for Doritos and Cheetos, in recent years, the company has begun to deepen its presence in better-for-you snacks, launching new brands to target the natural and better-for-you consumer. It also recently acquired Bear Snacks and Health Warrior. Here to discuss with us today the benefits that at least one strategic investor can bring to the table, along with what he looks for in investment, is Daniel Grubbs, Managing Director of PepsiCo Venture Partners. Hi. Pick a chair, any chair.
How you doing?
Good. So I want to start with the basics. We actually had a lot of calls where I was like, explain this to me again. So PepsiCo's a really big corporation.
Yeah.
Tell me about the Ventures Group and its role within the organization.
Sure. No, thank you for having me. The Ventures Group is an entity within the broader organization that has been around for a number of years. And really our purpose and goal for the organization is to invest and support early stage businesses within the brand spectrum, but as well as some also commercial tech companies in the marketplace, and to lean in and support and help provide capital, but as well as hopefully even if more, a lot of value add, when it comes to a perspective around how to kind of grow and continue to scale those businesses, and hopefully the right way. Through those relationships, those might end up in resulting in a potential later stage acquisition, but it's also understood that might not always occur.
And what about other parts of the company? We've heard about the Hive, we've heard about Nutrition Greenhouse. Yeah. Can you I know you don't play in all of and work in all those spaces, but explain kind of what those are a little bit.
Yeah, and what
you don't do.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and those are all partner areas of our organization, and we're pretty closely connected. What we're trying to also do within the organization is, as we have some of our larger brands in the marketplace, you mentioned a few of them in the snack perspective, Cheetos and such, what we're also doing is continue to innovate, and innovate with a lot of brands and product spaces that are more nutrition forward. And we've also developed an organization within there to really kind of make sure that we're incubating a lot of those new innovations, and doing it in the right way, spending the right time in terms of making sure we're connecting it. So the Hive is one example of that, which is really more about 100% owned businesses that we want to make sure have the time and opportunity to reach the right channels, the right customers, find the right supplier partners in the marketplace, and kind of make sure that they're connecting and it's been mentioned here this morning as well as yesterday, and continue to do that in a really authentic way. And so that's a group for us who's a partner of the Ventures Group. In many cases, there's a connection and a shared understanding about the dynamics that are going on in the industry, with some of our Venture Group portfolio companies, as well as some of the opportunities that the Hive is trying to develop. And so there's other entities within the organization, Nutrition Greenhouses, which is more of an accelerator program, a way for us to give back and kind of partner back into the ecosystem. It's also really good for our folks within the organization to make sure that they're staying close as they're developing and leading brands or leading supply chain or leading procurement, making sure that they understand and are staying tapped into what's happening at sort of the earlier stage, and offer support back in with their knowledge and expertise. So a lot of these different aspects of the organization continue to operate, really strong in sort of their functional areas, but we're also closely connected, as sort of leaders within those groups to make sure that they're all moving forward, but we're also sharing in terms of our experiences.
And we've talked a lot about evolution and change. How has the Ventures Group evolved over time?
Yeah, I think for us it's the roots go back, a number of years in terms of even on the beverage side, but as well as the snack side around how do we make sure that we're continue to stay close to what these trends are. And always internally innovating isn't always necessarily the best choice, particularly where it's, say, a marketplace that really requires a greater consumer education, that maybe that, we don't have either the knowledge base, it's a set of capabilities in terms of how products are being developed, so a new process or a new function, and a lot of times, that might require a whole set of capital expenditure, and so sometimes those are spaces where it's really understood, and so it's the Ventures Group evolution, but the broader organization is that there's some spaces where it's probably the best choice is to partner back into the ecosystem in a right way to, kind of help and support those. And so for us, it's an area where, from a brand perspective, we continue to look at marketplaces within snacks and foods, in particular, that continue to be more nutrition forward. So, what that really means for us is, naturally a new set of ingredients, a new set of benefits, whether it's energy, it's uplift, or it's relaxation aspects to foods, or it continues to be more protein and more fiber. And so those are a lot of spaces that continue to be of interest to us. And how that's evolved for us is to make sure that we're continuing to stay as closely connected in the marketplace.
And I think that point about innovating internally versus investing externally is important. I know this came up with Nestle, is sometimes there's this concern like, oh, I'm scared to show my product to a big corporation because what if they just, take my idea or something like that.
Yeah.
So how does that work? Like if you guys decide you're going to look externally, besides just the consumer base and education, is there anything else that would inspire you to go externally versus looking internally?
Yeah, no, we take a lot of time even before we even get to the point of talking to any companies, is making sure that there's a clear understanding about what are the spaces that we're going to innovate into and what are the spaces that are really more about potential opportunities to go invest into. So we make that decision very early on before we even get to the company side. And then once we get to the company side, it's a very clear core understanding that these are spaces and areas and the brands within those that are separate from where we want to innovate as a business. And so we try not to have those two things overlap. Mm-hmm. In part also because the idea too also of what we're trying to do from an investment perspective is to support and lean in and bring the balance of the organization as partners to bring value back in. And that's too much of a conflict if we're also innovating and competing in that same space. So we actually really designate and create a separation from that regard.
Got it. So what does a typical deal look like? Is there a typical deal?
I wish there was. No, actually, there is not. I mean, I think, generally speaking, I would say typical would be is that for like a lot of other investors and venture capital firms, right, is that we're involved at a very early stage. That could be a few million in sales up north. Going north of that, I'll just say. But we come in as a minority investor. We're really there to, and hopefully also be a partner with other investors on the cap table. We like that a lot. I think we know we don't bring everything to the table, and so for us is we want to come in as a supporting element to the business, and so from a deal perspective, that's going to be a deal-to-deal structure, and it's also kind of somewhat based upon where that company is in their journey, right, and what's really required and potential capabilities that they still have to maybe put in place, and so what capital is required to do that. And whether so we'll go in early. We'll go in pretty early from a funding perspective, but also go still also later stage growth stage.
Is there one way you kind of lean more? I know a lot of people here usually are like, oh, do I fit?
Yeah. I mean, like I was saying, I think to us is we're very comfortable going in pretty early, particularly if we think and see is that the opportunity has some real scale potential. We also understand though is that might come in a few years, and so that there's going to be the journey through to that point. But particularly if those products are delivering on a core set of attributes in terms of convenience, taste, texture, particularly, and that we think it's something that from a food and snack perspective people are going to want to come back to on a frequent basis. But we understand maybe that the consumer hasn't fully adopted that behavior or understanding. But we think if those triggers can be unlocked, that could be something significant. So, we could call it the core identity very early on. We do a lot of work up front to make sure, how that brand or their product is delivering on those, and so that we become very comfortable.
And so I mean, you touched upon this a little, but what can you guys bring to the table, or any large strategic company bring to the table that's different than, we heard from specialized venture capital yesterday, or, a private equity group?
Yeah, I mean, I think we try to. So if I think about it in kind of three broad strokes, and is there's a strategic, an insight perspective, and so one of those from that regard is we have a whole set of proprietary sets of insights that we want to share, and so those insights might be around the consumer and the shopper, particularly in the snacking space and broader food and beverage space. That's also relevant and applicable, and we're very comfortable kind of leaning in and sharing that perspective. And how that information becomes very helpful is obviously product development, innovation, but positioning of the products. There's a lot of operational perspective as well as the second lane, in terms of, as businesses are growing and scaling and they're moving from, say, co-packer to manufacturing themselves at maybe a later stage, that's something pretty wieldy to take on, and how do you think through those dynamics, right? And how do you make sure you're also putting in the quality standards, or even just from a regulatory, and as you're particularly in the snacking world, thinking of delivering on a core set of ingredients and benefits, how do you deliver those from a claim perspective, right? And we've gone through this, with our businesses, and that we're more than comfortable sharing that perspective and say, consider this, and have some of the best practices. It's going to be a little bit different in every regard, but we think that those are situations and that we've gone through as an organization and lived through, from that experience. And so what we do as a group is make sure that we're bringing the balance of the organization and that perspective to life for the companies.
And you mentioned your employees staying, having their finger on the pulse of what's going on. Is the hope that you at PepsiCo will also benefit from these brands, sort of being on the cutting edge and being more innovative, or not being more innovative, but being innovative?
I'm sorry, just make sure I understand your question. So that the brands in the marketplace.
Do you think PepsiCo as a company
Yeah.
will also benefit from the venture brands you're bringing in? Will they inspire the company?
Oh, completely. No, I mean, I think that I'll just say this, the people who work for PepsiCo are just like, a lot of folks here and as elsewhere in terms of, consumers of many of these brands. And so it's also invigorating and inspiring as well to have these companies come in and be a part of the businesses that they now get to work on as well. And so I think, most definitely it's the opportunity to then continue that and expand that, as an opportunity. Particularly in our snacking space, we have a set of we would call more premium alternative snacks, in terms of Stacy's, Off the Eaten Path, and Imagine, and Red Rock Deli, and the folks working there, have also worked on other parts of the business, and now Bear, as an example, is one of those, and it continues to kind of, keep them inspired in terms of that at work experience and how they take it back to then when they go work on some of the other businesses.
And we did have a question. You've mentioned snacking a lot. So
Yeah.
Is that the only type of company you're looking at? What does snacking mean exactly? Because as a lot of the research shows, kind of almost anything is a snack nowadays.
Completely. I mean, the world of nutrition versus snack versus meal or a mini meal, right? And I think we go less by maybe that lens, in terms of really more is how the consumer is eating through their day parts, and particularly, the mid-morning period of time becomes such a big focus now, and mini meals, might be a solution, which actually might be, in some cases, a combination of snacks, or in some cases, it can actually be sort of a compartment, like a bento box type solution, and here in the U.S. as well as elsewhere. So for us, snacking, right, in that regard, is really this way of satisfying almost a meal occasion in that regard. And some folks want to have multiple over the day versus kind of still the set three core guidelines. So for us, it doesn't necessarily always mean a bagged element, right, that you open and close, even whether you open or close, but it could also be more on that mini meal set of solutions.
And you mentioned this idea of Port becoming a platform brand.
Yeah.
And so because there's this path to acquisition, possibly. Does that change what you're looking for? It seems like you're not just looking for something that you're going to exit in 5 to 7 years. You're looking for something that can really stay with the company
right.
for a long period of time.
No, most definitely. I mean, Quaker is a brand that's 140 years old, right? So it's like we want to make sure that these aren't going to ride a wave and kind of crash in that respect, but also that these are brands. And actually that's one of the big things is that we're not just looking for a product space or something that consumers are looking for to meet a set of benefits or needs. It's really also what's the brand that's surrounding that, right? And how's that brand, because that's what they're going to stay tried and true to. And that as a company, we want to continue to be, hopefully at a later stage, the stewards and kind of leading and owning that business, but continue to have that brand live on, for at least the multiple generations is the idea, and that not that it kind of comes and goes in that regard. So we make sure also up front, it's understood as like what is the brand, and some of that is still going to be worked on over time. We understand that, but that identity, right, and what it's really going to stand for, and how does the consumer relate to what that brand's about, and how does that brand relate also back to the product in that regard.
What are some signs that a brand has the ability to platform and has the ability to really have staying power for 25, 50, 100 something years?
I wish there was an easy, but I think it's in the having it. I don't think it's trying to become too many things necessarily. It's really trying to own your space, and whether that space is a small niche space or something that has potential to become something much larger. As I think the ability to live on, is the ability to be sort of relevant and be a leader within that space on a continual basis. And I don't think that necessarily you put that element in place today, and that necessarily is the magic dust. I think it's also about how you continue to support and foster and develop that brand over time. Right? So how do you keep it alive? How do you keep it fresh? I mean, there's a number of 101 examples of things that essentially have fallen off over time because it's not how you kind of make sure that you're innovating, which is why also as a company who still has a number of brands, why it's still important for us to continue to innovate in those brands as well.
Mm-hmm. How do you kind of, I think you touched upon this a little, but ascertain, fad versus trend versus staying power? Because right now, as we touched upon yesterday, we've seen low carb, gluten-free, grain-free, now keto, paleo. How do you figure out which of these health attributes really has staying power?
Yeah, I honestly, for us, I don't think we necessarily look at it through that lens. I think it's exactly that. I think a lot of those things are going to come and go. I think that the core tenet of what those are getting at is, trying to help consumers live a better life, right? And some are particularly looking for, they're going to associate with one diet versus another diet, and so we don't look for those. We're not looking to solve necessarily a diet, and I say diet in the broad strokes of what the term, but more about can your brand, can the business, can the products, call it, satisfy some of those? Great, but are you solely identified? Because I think there's enough examples where those things come and go over time, and I think for us it's something where, whether we own the business or not at a later point, we would hope that any of those businesses are going to be able to have long-term staying power.
And you and I before this chatted about how along the lines of kind of diet and eating habits, how you guys see the industry as sort of a Venn diagram of two types of snacks and where they overlap in the center. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's functionality, and there's this idea of really wanting what you're consuming to really make sure it's making an impact for you, right? And how is it, back to this point, helping helping yourself from a benefit and actually, a health perspective. And so on one end of the spectrum, and you see a number of things where it actually significantly making a nutritional impact, or it's a material impact to your, to you. I think you see that more necessarily in beverages. I think in the food snack space, it hasn't been as pronounced. I think a lot of the foods have been more related to diet trends, some of those that you just mentioned, right? So I think it's an opportunity still in the snacking space to be more function forward in terms of trying to solve for, aspects that you see much more in the beverage space, right? In terms of moods as well as specific energy around aspects of products that can specifically deliver on that. The other end of the spectrum, right, and the other side of that is more of I just want simple enjoyment, right? And I want products that taste good, that have a unique and interesting texture, which is a space, an opportunity unto itself. We find that texture matters equally as much as taste within particularly the snacking and food spectrum. And then somewhere in the middle there where those things overlap is sort of that combination of, where you can deliver on those core attributes of a product, right? It's not, you don't have to put too much thought into it, right? But also it's still a better for you solution in terms of either the ingredients that you've come to, and that middle ground there is really this interesting set of opportunities, right? Now that's really challenging to really deliver on both sides of that at the same time, not just in terms of complexity, but cost structure and how do you continue to grow and scale that. So we understand that as well.
Can you give some examples, maybe from your portfolio of brands that are on both sides of the spectrum, just so we kind of have an idea?
Well, we don't really get into our current portfolio, but in terms of products that
under PepsiCo, not in the
got it. Yeah. No, and I think we have in the snacking space, particularly Doritos and Cheetos, as you mentioned, is things that we understand what those products are about, and consumers understand what those products are about, and they deliver on taste and texture and flavor, and as primary elements. On the other end, that function forward space, as I was mentioning, I don't think that necessarily we've cracked that nut, and we've put as much against that from a food perspective, as well as snack. I think even some of our Quaker aspects, we've actually gone more in that direction around really the beta-glucans of oats in that regard. But that's probably sort of the extent of it. In that middle space is where we've put a lot more attention in terms of innovation around, as I mentioned, off the eaten path and some of those aspects, which is around how do you deliver on legumes but still deliver taste, in that regard.
And what are your thoughts kind of on functional foods that promise health benefits? Like, I know you said that's of interest to the company, but I think that's a hard line for brands where they don't want to overpromise, but they need to promise enough that there's, the consumer's interested.
Completely, and I think that's a line you got to walk carefully as well in terms of making unsubstantiated claims, into that space. So I think the best thing is, it's more related to benefits and ingredients that are more understood in terms of what the delivery is and what that is, rather so you can kind of associate more with that versus you having to kind of go make the claim yourself. So I think that's sort of the key. Now, what those are, in terms of delivering on set of benefits, whether it's inflammation or immunity or whatever those things are, I think it's trying to operate in that space, but maybe much more tied to the actual ingredient and how the consumer already maybe understands that, right? How they understand what turmeric does, as an example, right? Without you having to go speak so directly, and make some claims around turmeric.
Well, thank you so much for sharing about the Ventures Group today, and I appreciate you joining us on the stage.
Thank you.